Hello there, fellow cultists. This is DM Nell, and I'm back with another episode of Shadow the Demon Lord Talk. And today we continue my series of the comparison of Dungeons and Dragons with Shadow the Demon Lord. The reason I'm doing these videos right now is because of the one D&D announcement that was made a few weeks back. And whenever there's an edition change in D&D, you got people that start really considering where they're at with their role-playing experience, whether they want to jump to the new edition when it finally comes out, whether they want to stick with the old edition, try some even older editions, or perhaps even look elsewhere for whatever other options are out there. Shadow of the Demon Lord is definitely one of those options, and it's one that I've been trying to spread. And so hopefully my videos will help some of you decide whether this is a game for you or not. All right, so the thing I think what I'd like to do is in this video we're going to be talking about playing the game. So I think we will continue with looking at my D&D Beyond account and just using the basic rules, going through the basic rules for the various things you need to play the game. So in the last few videos we talked about ancestries, what type of race you want to be, comparing the races that D&D offers versus the races or the ancestries that Shadow the Demon Lord offers. Now, of course, we're just talking about the basic offering in the core rule books of each. Both games have expanded options for all the things that we're talking about, but just right now focusing on the core options. All right, so we talked about that. We've also talked about the various classes, and the Shadow the Demon Lord has paths. So just kind of talk through that. So today we'll be talking about actually playing the game. So in order to play the game, your character sheet has to be filled out. You have to have already selected your ancestry or your race, your path, or your class, depending on which game you're playing. So starting with D&D, and then I will compare that to Shadow the Demon Lord. Your character basically is made up of its ability scores. In D&D, the ability score, there are 6 ability scores, and they are, as everybody knows, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Shadow the Demon Lord only has 4 ability scores: strength, agility, intellect, and willpower. So the reason why there's only 4, and the reasoning given by Robert Schwab, the designer of the game, is really strength and constitution are pretty much the same thing. And charisma is kind of rolled up into wisdom in Shadow the Demon Lord. He wanted to keep it as simple as possible, and condensing these 6 down to 4 is one way to simplify the game without really losing a whole lot. So just like in D&D, the ability score provides you a modifier. Now, the basic mechanic for both games is the same. You roll a d20, you add your ability score modifier, and then you add any additional situational or conditional modifiers, and then you compare that result to a target number, whether that be the defense or the armor class, or a difficulty number that your GM provides you or DM provides you. So the basic mechanic of both games is pretty much the same. The devil's in the details, though. So for D&D, the ability scores range anywhere from 1 to 30, and the ability score modifier depends on your ability score. So just starting at 10 to get into the positive modifiers. 10 and 11 is plus 0, 12 to 13 is plus 1, 14 to 15 is plus 2, and so on. In Shadow the Demon Lord, it's much simpler. 10 is plus 0, 11 is plus 1, 12 is plus 2, 13 is plus 3, and so on. 9 is minus 1, 8 is minus 2, 7 is minus 3, and so on. So Shadow the Demon Lord keeps it simple, basing the modifier on 1-step increments, as opposed to D&D having 2-step increments. The other difference between what ability scores mean in D&D versus what they mean in Shadow the Demon Lord is that really beyond providing a modifier, the ability score doesn't mean anything in D&D. It's just kind of there. And of course, it helps you understand what the modifier is if your ability score increases or decreases. So if you get a magic item that increases your ability score by 1, or you increase your ability score due to a level advancement, then you know what effect that has on your modifier. But ultimately, it still just affects your modifier. It doesn't have any other effect on the game. Whereas in Shadow of the Demon Lord, your ability scores are your defenses. So you have a strength defense, you have an agility defense, you have a wisdom defense, and you have a what am I missing? Agility, strength, agility, wisdom, intellect. So you have 4 defenses, meaning that certain attacks can target your strength score or your intellect score or your willpower score or your whatever the 4th one is. Short-term memory loss. It's a bitch. So the ability score in Shadow of the Demon Lord actually means something, and it is how you measure your character's defense for that particular attribute. So that's one difference between the 2 games that I really like better in Shadow of the Demon Lord, is that the ability score actually means something. Okay, so that's one of the differences. Another difference here, it talks about in D&D. D&D you can get advantage and disadvantage, as you know. That's a situational modifier that allows you to roll 2d20, and you either take the better of the 2 rolls if you have advantage, or you take the worse of the 2 rolls if you have disadvantage. Shadow of the Demon Lord's version of that is the Boon and Bane system. Now in Shadow of the Demon Lord, Boons and Banes essentially serve the same purpose as advantage and disadvantage. They are situational modifiers to the task resolution determinant roll. Task resolution is basically your d20 roll plus your ability modifier plus any situational or conditional modifiers. So that's to determine whether you succeed at a task. And that core mechanic, as I said earlier, is the same in both games. However, advantage and disadvantage are the situational modifier. In D&D, you roll 2d20 and take the better or the worse, depending on whether you have advantage or disadvantage. And in Shadow of the Demon Lord, you have boons and banes. Boons are d6s that you add to your d20 roll. Banes are d6s that you subtract from your d20 roll. So if you have a favorable situation, you might have one boon, which means you would roll a d20, add your ability modifier, and then roll a d6 along with it and add that to the total. A bane would be the opposite. You roll a d20 plus your ability modifier, but you subtract a d6 from that result to get your total to determine whether you succeed or not. So boons and banes cancel each other out. So if you have 2 boons and 1 bane, then the net of that is just 1 boon. So from that perspective, it's a little bit more complicated than D&D. D&D is pretty simple. You just have advantage or disadvantage. But advantage and disadvantage is really good. I mean, rolling 2d20, I believe if I remember correctly, somebody said that that's the equivalent of getting a +5 modifier to your roll. Now, granted, with Boon and Bane, you could get a +6 if you're rolling, but the average is going to be around +3. So boons and banes are a little bit better balanced than advantage and disadvantage. So I tend to like the boon bane system better. And it's a little bit more complicated, but not really, not that much. All right, so anyway, that is that. So then we go to proficiency bonus. Now, proficiency bonus is a D&D thing. There's not really an equivalent in Shadow of the Demon Lord. So as for D&D, you have a proficiency bonus that you add to your D20 rolls for things such as saving throws, skill checks, ability checks, and that sort of thing. And that increases as you get higher in level. Basically what that means is that if you're proficient at something, you would add this modifier. If you're not proficient at something, then you don't add this modifier. In Shadow the Demon Lord, that's really kind of rolled up into the boon and bane mechanic. So if you have quote-unquote proficiency in, say, fishing, and you're trying to catch a fish, then you would add a boon to your task resolution roll. Conversely, if you are trying to climb a mountain and you've never, you grew up on the plains and you never so much as seen a hill, then you might have 3 banes to the attack roll. Now, one thing I didn't mention about boons and banes up here is that boons and banes are not cumulative. If you have 3 banes, for example, and you roll 3d6, you don't add all 3 dice together to add that result to your task resolution roll. Instead, you roll 3d6, and then the highest number is the number that you take, either for boons or for banes. So if you roll 3d6, you get a 2, 4, and a 6. The only number that you would keep and add to your task resolution roll would be the 6. So that's why I said it's a little bit more complicated, but you catch on pretty quickly. All right, so proficiency bonus doesn't exist in Shadow the Demon Lord. Ability checks. Ability checks tests a character or monster's innate talent and training in an effort to overcome a challenge. So you might have a strength roll to bust down a door. You might have a strength check. You might have an agility check to climb a wall, or to unlock a lock. So ability checks have difficulty classes that the DM would set for any given task, which start anywhere from 5, which is very easy, all the way up to 30, which is nearly impossible. Now, how that differs with Shadow the Demon Lord is that the difficulty class in Shadow the Demon Lord is always the same number. It's always 10. So you always know what your difficulty is going to be. You always try to get 10 or better on any type of agility check or ability check. And in Shadow the Demon Lord, it's not called an ability check, it's called a challenge roll. So when you make a challenge roll, it could be a strength challenge roll, it could be an intellect challenge roll. Regardless, you try to get 10 or better. Now, the way the DM makes the task more or less difficult is by adding boons and banes to the roll. So a particularly easy task, you might have 1 or 2 boons to your challenge roll in Shadow the Demon Lord. If you have a particularly difficult challenge, then you might get 1 or more banes added to your roll. And that takes the place of the scale of difficulty classes, makes it a lot easier for the DM. And basically all the DM has to say is that, yeah, that's a pretty tough lock. You're going to make your challenge roll with 2 banes. And then the rest is up to the player to roll. So that's the difference between the ability checks in D&D versus the challenge rolls in Shadow the Demon Lord. Contests is basically when you are in D&D, well, let me just read it here. It says, sometimes one character or monster's efforts are directly opposed to another. This can occur when both of them are trying to do the same thing. This situation applies when one of them is trying to prevent another from accomplishing a goal. For example, a monster tries to force open a door that an adventurer is holding closed. In situations like these, the outcome is determined by a special form of ability check called a contest. So both participants in the contest make ability checks appropriate to their efforts. They apply all the appropriate bonuses and penalties, but instead of comparing the total to a DC, they compare their totals of their 2 checks. So a monster that is trying to bust down the door makes a strength challenge roll or a strength ability check, and let's say he rolls a 15. Then the player who's trying to hold the door makes a strength ability check, and he rolls an 11. So the monster's roll is higher, he busts down the door, and the player goes flying across the room. So that's a contest in D&D. So in Shadow the Demon Lord, you have something similar, but basically you are making an attack against an opponent's ability score. So in that situation, and basically it's the same concept, you make a strength attack roll against the opponent's appropriate defense, which in this case would be strength. So the monster would make a strength attack roll, and the player would oppose it with his strength defense score. And the monster has to roll higher than the character's strength. If he does, the task succeeds. If he doesn't, the task fails. So that's the difference between contests in Demon Lord and D&D. Skills is another big difference. Skills, there's actually a set of skills in Dungeons and Dragons that is listed on character sheets and based on ability scores. So under strength, you have athletics. Under dexterity, you have acrobatics, sleight of hand, and stealth. Under intelligence, you have arcana, history, investigation, nature, and religion, and so on. If you want to make a skill check, let's say you want to see if you have heard the lore of a particular magic item that you run across, then you might get an arcana skill check, or you might get a history check. And depending on whether you're skilled or not, or proficient or not in that ability, would determine whether or not you add your proficiency bonus to that particular role in D&D. Shadow of the Demon Lord doesn't have a skill list. Basically, it's basically your skill rolls are based on your background and your professions. So if you were a lore master, or let's say you were a scribe, or you served under a priest, then you might have an opportunity to know. You may have run across some old texts. You might have run across some old books of lore that talks about these magic items or enchanted items, as they're called in Shadow of the Demon Lord, and you may know something about them. But that's based on whether your past has exposed you to that information, as opposed to just an arbitrary, I have proficiency in history or arcana because I checked that box on my character sheet. In Shadow of the Demon Lord, it's actually tied into your professions that you determine at character creation. So that's the difference between skills how they're handled in D&D versus Shadow of the Demon Lord. In D&D, you have passive checks. Shadow of the Demon Lord does not have passive checks. Working together, you can kind of do that in both games. In D&D, you use the help action. In Shadow of the Demon Lord, there's also similar action that you can assist with, but of course the mechanics differ. In Shadow of the Demon Lord, you would be adding a boon if you are assisting a fellow character. In D&D, you might give a character advantage if you are helping that character. Okay, so let's see, group checks. That's more of a D&D thing. We don't really have that in Shadow of the Demon Lord. And let's see what else we have here. It just kind of goes on to the different type of ability score checks. So I think that's good as far as ability scores and the associated parts of the game for that. So let's see what is next in the basic rules for playing the game. Oh, and I forgot saving throws. Saving throws is another mechanic that is specific to D&D. You don't really have saving throws in Shadow of the Demon Lord. They're essentially, they fall into the challenge roll mechanic. So if a player is trying to resist a particular effect, then they might make a strength challenge roll or a willpower challenge roll. All right, so let's talk about adventuring. So the adventuring section here in the D&D Beyond starts with time. So the time in the game, outside of combat, is handled pretty much the same as it is in any game. It's at the pace of whatever pace the DM or the GM sets. Once you start getting into combat, however, then time matters. So a round in Shadow of the Demon Lord is 10 seconds long, whereas in D&D, a round is 6 seconds long. So there are 10 rounds in a minute in D&D, whereas there's only 6 rounds in a minute in Shadow of the Demon Lord. So that is one big difference as far as that goes. Movement, basically the same in both games. Although, let's talk about movement just a little bit. Both games are kind of moving towards a theater of the mind type of system, which I don't like. I like counting squares. I like very precise placement on a battle mat so that I know where things are in relation to each other, rather than some kind of arbitrary mental picture that I'm supposed to be building based off of somebody's ability to paint that mental picture. Some RPGs use zones, which I believe that the next iteration of Shadow of the Demon Lord, which is going to be called Shadow of the Weird Wizard, is moving toward in that direction. But D&D still kind of doesn't really have a zone type of mechanic, at least not in the core rules. So it uses feet basically. And if you're using a grid, square is 5 feet. If you're not using a grid, then you just use feet. So you say, I'm going to run up and attack the monster. How far away is the monster from me? If you're using Theater of the Mind, and the demon would have to say the monster is 45 feet away from you, and you have a 30-foot movement, so you cannot reach the monster this round. That's how that goes in the Theater of the Mind. And of course, if you're using a grid, 5 squares, you can just count out how many squares you have to see if you can make it to the monster or not. So movement is pretty much more or less the same. Difficult terrain is pretty much handled the same in both games. All the various types of movement are handled basically the same in both games. Most of this other stuff, environment, falling, suffocating, vision and light, pretty much the same. Blind sight, dark vision, they're called different things, but you have pretty much the same in both games. And social interaction. Okay, so social interaction in D&D is basically role playing, and then you have some ability checks. In Shadow of the Demon Lord, you actually have social combat, in which if you're trying to convince a somebody that you're telling the truth, then you would make an attack roll versus their. Let's say you would make a will attack roll against the opponent's intellect to see if they believe you or not. So that's how it's handled in Shadow of the Demon Lord. But in D&D, it's basically you either role play it out or you make an ability check. And of course, in Shadow of the Demon Lord, you can role play it out too. But there is specifically a mechanic for social combat. Let's see here. Resting. So this is a fairly significant difference between the two games. D&D has a short rest and a long rest. If you do a short rest, then you can heal up using hit dice. If you do a long rest, then you can heal up everything. You get all your spell slots back. You get all your hit points back. All you got to do is rest for 8 hours. You're good as new. Shadow of the Demon Lord has a rest, which basically means that you have to spend 8 hours of uninterrupted rest, in which at the end of, then you can get some of your health restored. It's definitely not as forgiving as D&D is, although you do get your spells back in Shadow of the Demon Lord just like you do in D&D. You're just not healed up automatically like you are in D&D. Okay, so let's see. This talks about crafting, downtime. We're not going to get into any of that. So let's go to the next chapter, which is combat. So combat, fairly similar in both games. There are a couple of differences. So let's start with D&D, and I'll just tell you what the difference is in Shadow of the Demon Lord as we go. So, first of all, you determine surprise. That's the same. You have to make a determination as to whether both both opposing parties in the forthcoming combat are aware of each other, or if one side is aware and the other side is not. That determines whether you have a situation that calls for surprise. Established positions, well, yeah, I mean, that should go without saying. You kind of have to know where everything is before you start the combat. Then in D&D, you roll initiative. You roll a d20, you add each character rolls a d20, adds their ability modifier for dexterity, and that determines their place in the turn order. And then the DM does the same for the opponents. Once that's done, then the person who has the highest initiative roll goes first, the person or creature, and then it just goes in descending order after that. Some people like to say that the person with the highest initiative starts, and then you just go around the table clockwise or counterclockwise from that person's position. So, however you decide to do it at your table is fine, but, basically starts with an initiative roll. Shadow of the Demon Lord is handled differently. For initiative, nothing is rolled. The players decide whether they're going to take a fast turn or a slow turn. So there are two parts to a round. There's the fast turn and the slow turn. The fast turn means that you can take an action or a move. Not both. So you choose. I'm going to move as my fast action, or I'm going to attack, or you do an action as my fast action, or my fast turn. Then there's a slow turn. So if you want to do more than just one of those two things, if you want to do both, take an action and move, then you wait and go on the slow turn. So the advantage of going on the slow turn means that you can do more during the round. The disadvantage of going on the slow turn is that you have to wait to go on the slow turn. So everything that goes on the fast turn goes before you. That includes the players and the monsters that decide to take a fast turn. The other difference is that in Shadow of the Demon Lord, the player characters always go before the monsters do. So any player character that decides to go on the fast turn will go before any monster that decides to go on the fast turn goes. So the turn order would then be fast turns for the players, then fast turns for the monsters or NPCs, then slow turns for the players, and then slow turns for the monsters. So once all of that has been resolved, then you have the end of round. The end of round is where any bookkeeping that needs to be done for spell effects or to determine whether a condition expires or not. It's called an Affliction in Shadow of the Demon Lord. Then that's where that is all determined. Once the end of round is completed, then you start a new round. And the players decide again if they want to go on the fast turn or the slow turn. So that's how it's handled in Shadow of the Demon Lord. Now, why is this an important difference between the two games? Well, you can strategize with the slow turn, fast turn initiative better than you can with the D&D roll the highest initiative system. If you try to do that in D&D, basically you are stuck with your place in the initiative order. So if you want to do something cool in the next round of combat, but your place in the turn order isn't a great place for you to do that, then you can't really strategize that well. You can try to prepare an action, but that doesn't always work out, especially if you roll low on your initiative. And the trigger for your prepared action never happens, or it happens before your turn. So the initiative system in D&D is pretty limited. It's simple, and it's easy, and it's fast, but it's limited. In Shadow of the Demon Lord, the initiative system, the turn orders, allow you to strategize with your fellow players. So if you want to set up something so that another party member could take advantage of that setup, then you can choose to go on the fast turn. Your peer can decide to go on the slow turn. You do what you need to do to set up a situation, and then when it gets to the slow turn, the player decides to go on a slow turn, gets to take advantage of the thing that you set up. So that is, I think, an advantage that the Shadow of the Demon Lord game has over D&D. It's just better for the players to try to plan things out and to strategize. Now, it does eat up a little bit more time, because then now we have a conversation going around every round, at the start of every round, where players are trying to decide whether they want to go fast or slow, if they want to strategize, and there's a discussion about that. So that can really kind of slow things down. But once you start getting into the groove of it, it gets better. All right, so that is the order of combat between the two systems. And let's see what else we have. Okay, so let's talk about the action economy. The action economy in both systems are fairly similar with some minor differences. So in both systems, you have basically every round, or every turn, I should say, you have an action that you can take, a move that you can make, and potentially a reaction that you can take. A reaction typically has to be triggered, or you have to have an ability that allows you to use it on a reaction. This is in D&D. And same in Shadow of the Demon Lord. Now, where the action economy differs between the two systems is in the bonus actions that are in D&D. D&D has things like, they have abilities in certain classes that use bonus actions, which allow the player to do things outside of the normal action economy. So, if they already took an action, they could use a bonus action to do something else in the same round. You don't really have that in Shadow of the Demon Lord. Some classes or some paths allow you to take an additional action as part of your turn, which is kind of similar as a bonus action. It's not called that in Shadow of the Demon Lord, but essentially it's pretty much the same thing. But it's limited to that path's the specifications for that path. And of course, in D&D, bonus actions are limited by the class that you are taking, or the ability that you have in that class, or the spell that you are trying to cast. So again, fairly similar combat structure and action economy. Now, from a DM's perspective, there's some differences. In D&D, you've got legendary monsters that have legendary actions. A legendary action can have means that a monster can act after another character acts so many times per round. And then they might have legendary resistances, which means that they can resist something or remove a condition that's on them. They may also have layer actions, which gives them additional things that they can do during the round if they happen to be in their layer. Shadow of the Demon Lord doesn't have all of that. They have an ability called Epic Adversary, which allows a monster to take more than one action in a round. And then they have Epic, I think it's called Epic Resistance, where they can remove an Affliction at the end of the round. So a little bit similar, but in D&D you have a few more tools to play with as far as legendary monsters go than you do in Shadow of the Demon Lord with the Epic Adversary and Resistance abilities. Okay, so let's see, what else do we have here? Let's talk a little bit about conditions and afflictions. So in both games you have things that can happen to your characters that can have lasting effects, and these are called either in Shadow of the Demon or in D&D they're called conditions, and in Shadow of the Demon Lord they are called afflictions. And basically they are the same thing. Maybe have some different, a few minor differences, but essentially they hamper the character in some way, shape, or form. So, for example, in Shadow of the Demon Lord, if you have the impaired condition, then an impaired creature makes all attack rolls and challenge rolls with 1 bane. You would have something similar in D&D, but instead of a bane being imposed, you might have disadvantage imposed. So that's the comparison of afflictions and conditions. Actions in combat and movement in combat are fairly similar in both games. They're called different things, and slight differences, but basically the same. One area in Shadow of the Demon Lord that actually is a little bit more robust is in providing specific combat actions that you can take, which allow you to do things like doing a called shot. Those things don't really exist in D&D formally. I know that there are probably some people that house rule that sort of stuff, but the core rules, again, that doesn't really exist in D&D, but it does exist in the core rules in Shadow of the Demon Lord, which I dig. All right, so let's see what else we have here. Making an attack is basically the same between both systems. Both systems have cover. Both systems have some form of concealment or obscurity. Both systems have melee and ranged attacks. Both systems have a form of opportunity attack. In D&D it's called an opportunity attack. In Shadow of the Demon Lord it's called a free attack. But they're triggered basically the same way. And let's see what else. All right, damage and healing. Let's talk about that a little bit. So everybody knows that in D&D, characters have armor classes to avoid damage, but when they are hit, they have hit points from which damage is deducted. When you're out of hit points, then you start making death saving throws to determine if you are going to stabilize or you're going to end up dying as a result of your wounds. Shadow of the Demon Lord has a kind of a similar mechanic, but it's a little bit different. Instead of hit points, it has a health score, and a character's health score doesn't change during combat. Unless there's something that specifically targets the health. Instead, when a character takes damage, the player accumulates the damage on their character sheet. So if you take 5 points of damage this round, then next round you take 8 more points of damage, then you have a total of 13 points of damage. Once your damage is equal to your health score or greater than your health score, then that's when you start to suffer the same effects as you would in D&D. Instead of death saving throws, you have fate rolls in D&D. So you become incapacitated when your damage equals your health. Then when you make a fate roll, you have to roll a d6 to determine whether you start getting better, you stay the same, or you get worse. If you get better, then you could potentially get a hit point back and be back in the action in the next round. Most of the time, you roll a d6 and the number's between 2 and 5, then nothing changes. You're just kind of laying there. If you roll a 1, that means your condition gets worse and you start to die. Then you have to make a fate roll to determine whether you get better from that stage or you get worse or you stay the same. So both systems have a buffer between being well and dead. And that buffer is just handled differently, but it's ultimately, it's the same concept. giving you, just a chance to recover and not automatically die once you've taken enough damage to do that. So that is that's the difference between D&D and Shadow of the Demon Lord, and how hit points, health, and damage are handled. Now, another thing that is different between the two games is whenever you roll damage in D&D, you always add your ability score modifier to the damage that you are rolling. So if you are attacking with a melee weapon that is strength based, then you would add your strength modifier to whatever damage your weapon does. Let's say you roll D8 for a crossbow attack, and you have +2 dexterity modifier. You would add the +2 to your D8 roll for the total damage. If you have a warhammer that does D8, I don't know what it does off the top of my head, but I'm going to say D8, and your strength is +3, then you would add the +3 to your D8 to determine how much damage you do to the monster. That's in D&D. In Shadow of the Demon Lord, you never add your ability score modifier to the damage roll. You only add it to the attack roll. The reason for that is because most of the character's abilities, they already have things built in that take those other factors into account. So the ability score modifier is not added to any damage that is rolled, unless the specific attack that they're making calls that out and says that you can. So that is, again, that's the difference between the two games as far as damage goes. Now, as far as armor class goes, pretty much handled the same way. It's a defense number. Armor makes it harder for you to be hit. I think maybe the biggest difference is, well, no, I think both have qualifiers to determine if you can wear armor, if you have any penalties while wearing armor. So if there are any differences, they're fairly minor. All right, let's see what else we have. I think that's it as far as combat goes. All right, and the next section is spellcasting. I think that's going to be a video all on its own. Don't really want to get into magic system just quite yet. So I think that is good as far as playing the game goes. We will go into the rules of magic and probably in my next video. So I guess this is a good place to wrap things up. If you like my videos, subscribe if you want to. Don't if you don't. Doesn't matter to me. I don't get paid for it. But if you do subscribe, that means that you'll know whenever I put out a new video. And I know you're waiting breathlessly every week for my videos. So, just be proactive about it, dude. Or dudette. Whatever you are. So, yeah, subscribe if you want to. What? How else can you support me? Don't really need support. I already got a full-time job. But if you want to throw a couple of coppers my way, I do have token sets that I sell on Roll20, the Roll20 marketplace. If you are into virtual tabletop gaming, my token sets are designed for Shadow of the Demon Lord play. So I tried to get most of the core monsters that don't already have a token represented out there. I mean, there's a million goblins, there's a million ogres, there's a million dragons. You're not going to see me drawing a whole lot of those. Those are already a dime a dozen out there. But how often are you going to find a filth goblin? You're not, but you will in my sets. So, yeah, if you want to throw a couple of coppers my way, go to the Roll20 marketplace, look up DMNL, and I think I have 7 sets out there. Pick up a couple. I don't need it, but hey, if it pays for my Roll20 subscription, great. One less bill that I need to worry about. So that's it. I'm done for today. I'm going to wrap it up here. So guess I'll catch you on my next video. Thanks for watching. And once again, hail to the Demon Lord. How do I turn this damn thing off?